Can you believe this? After a tornado leveled their small Kansas farm in the late 1980s, an elderly couple woke up to find their barn being rebuilt. Not by neighbors, not by the church, but by towering figures working silently in the mist. They left no names, only a wooden mark carved into the beam. This story, passed down from the Flint Hills, still survives in local memory. If you stay with me, you'll learn why they helped without asking for anything in return, what heartbreaking keepsake they returned to the grieving mother, and the strange symbol that remains on the barn door to this day. The family's grandson, Martin, swore he once saw those giant silhouettes at the edge of the field before they vanished into the fog, and the old army jacket of the son lost in Vietnam, restitched with braided grass, still hangs on the porch. Skip this, and you might never hear one of the most haunting rural legends of America. The morning began with a hush so delicate it might have broken under the weight of a whisper. Flint Hills stretched wide and breathing, a slow-moving sea of grass shifting under the brush of the breeze. Tall bluestem bowed to the rhythm of Kansas wind, their slender bodies whispering secrets in a language older than English. Cattle stood scattered like soft boulders across the green rise, tails flicking, chewing with no hurry. The dew still clung to fence wire, and the dirt road shimmered like it remembered last night's moon. Everything smelled like warm earth, cracked cedar, and dry hay. The perfume of a world still holding its breath between seasons. Nora Kincaid moved slow, but not out of frailty. 65 years weathered into her bones like etchings on river rock. Her frame was narrow, hands speckled with sun and time, and her silver hair was drawn back in a neat twist, pinned above the nape. She walked with a quiet purpose across the yard in worn canvas shoes, a folded cloth tucked under one arm, a metal pan in the other. A thin line of cornmeal crumbs followed behind her boots like a breadcrumb trail no one would ever find again. She reached the edge of the tree line, where the yard gave up its order to the wild. It was the same spot she always left her offerings, a small patch of flat stone shaded by a hickory tree that had stood longer than most men's lifetimes. She crouched and placed the cornbread gently beside a glass jar half full of cool water. Not for people, not for praise, just for whatever might need it. Her fingers rested on the rim for a moment before she stood. No words, just the silence between heartbeat and sky. Behind her, the old house sat back from the gravel road like a thing content to be forgotten. Its roof slanted with age, shutters tired on their hinges, the porch sagging into itself. Next to it, the barn, well, what was left of it, still bore the old red paint from Earl's father's time. The doors hung straight, but the frame leaned like a man who'd carried too much grief too long. Earl Kincaid had already been up for hours. 68, wide across the shoulders but bent at the waist, as if life had tried to fold him in half but hadn't quite finished. His left shoulder sat lower than the right, shrapnel from a job that never ended clean. He was sweeping the floorboards of the barn, pushing aside dust and dried straw with the same determination he used to swing a hammer 50 years ago. He didn't talk much anymore, didn't complain either. But when he paused and looked up at the rafters, you could tell he still saw ghosts. Inside the house, above the mantel, hung an olive-drab field jacket sealed behind glass. The name stitched in dull thread, J. Kincaid. Beside it, a small folded flag, and a photo of a boy in uniform whose smile hadn't reached his eyes. Nora dusted that frame every Sunday, every season, every time her knees would allow. Her hands never shook when she cleaned it. Only afterward, when the cloth was folded back in the drawer, and she sat alone at the window. The barn had once echoed with music, hammering, stories between father and son, mother and boy, old tools passed down like heirlooms. Now it held mostly dust and silence. And yet, Earl kept it upright. Not because it was useful. Most of the cattle slept under sky now, but because it was built with his father's hands, and later, his son's. That morning, As Nora sipped from her chipped mug on the porch, she saw the neighbor's truck crawl down the road, then pull in with a crunch of gravel. Buck Rollins stepped out with his usual grin, stained ball cap in hand. He had a way of laughing like he owned the whole damn prairie. "Y'all heard about them shadows by the ridge?" he said, boots kicking up dust. "Some say it's a bear. Others swear it walks like a man." Earl didn't bother answering. He kept hammering at a loose board on the stall door. Nora leaned on the porch post, watching the way the wind caught the hem of her apron. Buck chuckled and slapped his thigh. "I told him, only thing guarding these parts is me and my Winchester. Ain't no monster gonna make it past Buck Rollins." Nora's eyes narrowed just slightly, a slow blink. She said, quiet as prayer, "Not everything's meant to be guarded, Buck, and not everything answers to men." He laughed, but it rang hollow. She turned back toward the screen door without another word. Earl didn't lift his head. Later that day, as the wind picked up and the sky began its slow shift toward a stranger shade of green-gray, Nora returned to the hickory tree. The cornbread was gone. Not pecked apart, not dragged by ants. Gone clean, like it had been taken by hands. She didn't speak. Didn't mention it to Earl. Just placed another piece down, warm from the skillet. This time, with a slice of apple beside it. That evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, she paused by the barn, fingers brushing the weathered plank where her son had once carved his initials. The letters were faded now, softened by wind and time. She could still remember the sound of his laughter echoing inside those walls. The way he'd stood beside Earl, holding a beam steady with arms too thin, trying to be stronger than he was. Inside the house, she passed the coat one more time, eyes lingering on the mud-stained canvas, the stitched name that still carried weight. She reached up and brushed off a fine layer of dust, her touch barely a whisper. Out beyond the field, the cattle grew restless, ears twitching toward the trees. One of them lowed in a way that made Earl pause mid-step. His boots sank into soft earth as he turned to look. The edge of the woods shifted. Not with wind, not with branches, but with something taller than a man. Something that paused just long enough to let itself be seen or imagined. But Earl only turned back, muttering, "Buck's got folks spooked," and went back to hammering. Nora, however, stood at the back screen, her fingers on the wood, her breath caught in the space between fear and wonder. She said nothing, but her eyes did not leave the tree line. That night, as the wind howled louder and the air thickened with the promise of storm, Nora placed a wool blanket over the back of the porch chair, just in case someone needed warmth. Far across the prairie, thunder growled low like an engine just waking up. The barn creaked. The cattle shifted. The cornfields lay still under the weight of sky. And in the distance, something walked, slow, steady, staying just at the edge of human understanding. Nora didn't sleep much that night. Neither did Earl. Not from fear, but from something older. Something like knowing. And by morning, the world would tilt just slightly, as if something sacred had walked across it without leaving a trace. Almost. The wind shifted before the sky did. A strange heaviness crept in from the west, thick and metallic, like the breath before a sob. The clouds, once soft and drifting, pulled into tight rolls, green-gray and bruised like old fruit. Even the birds, usually bold around this time, went silent. Nora stood at the porch railing with one hand clutching her shawl at the collar, the other shading her eyes. The land looked wrong. The light had lost its color, like someone had drawn a curtain over the sun and forgotten to open it again. The grass still swayed, but with no rhythm now. Just nervous movement, like it wasn't sure which way to lean. Inside the barn, Earl paused mid-step. He'd been moving a sack of cracked corn, slow and steady, keeping busy out of habit. But something in the air stopped him cold. A shiver ran up his neck, not from chill, but from memory. a pressure, like the weight that settles on your chest when you wake up from a dream you can't quite remember. But you know it didn't end well. "Storm's coming," he muttered, voice gravel-scratched. He stepped out from the open barn door and looked up. The clouds were boiling now, low and fast. He could feel it in his ribs, in the old wound near his shoulder, a deep ache that only came when the world was about to break open. Nora didn't say a word when he reached her. She just nodded, eyes still locked on the ridge where the fields met the woods. They had seen storms before. Dust devils, heat lightning, hail the size of eggs. But this one, this felt old, heavy, like it had waited years for the right moment. "Basement," Earl said. She didn't argue, didn't ask. The cattle had begun to move now, uneasy, pressing against each other in a way that didn't match their usual calm. One of the dogs started whining inside the house, the sound long and low, like it was trying to warn something not to come closer. Earl pulled the cellar door open, his hands trembling slightly as he unhooked the latch. Nora moved down first, the steps familiar but still stiff beneath her knees. He followed, pausing only to grab the oil lamp from the wall and one of the old wool blankets from the bench. The air below was damp, lined with earth and time. Shelves of canned peaches, old tools, and dust-covered jars stood like ghosts, watching them settle into their storm seats. Earl lit the lamp, the flame flickering as if unsure whether to stay. Then it hit. It didn't come gradual. It came like a train off the rails, screaming across the prairie. The first roar shook the beams above them, dust sifting down from the joists. The dogs barked once, sharp, panicked, then went silent. The ground thudded with every second breath of wind, like a giant was pacing outside, waiting for someone to open the door. Earl held the lamp close, watching Nora's face more than the shadows around them. She sat still, hands clasped, lips moving just slightly, not quite praying, not quite remembering. Somewhere in between, they didn't speak. The noise outside made words pointless. There was a crash, sudden and vicious, like something massive had been ripped off its hinges and thrown. Earl flinched. Nora's eyes clenched tight. Then, a long groaning creak, like the very bones of the barn were being bent. Earl closed his eyes. Not the barn. Please, not the barn. But the wind didn't listen. It screamed louder, pitched higher, as if it had found what it came for. And then, silence. Not a peaceful one, the kind that follows disaster, the kind that waits. When Earl finally opened the door, the light had changed again. Pale, watery, the kind of dawn that feels like it shouldn't have survived. He stepped out slow, boots sinking into mud, eyes adjusting to what the wind had left behind. The barn was gone, not torn, not damaged, gone. In its place, a twisted patch of splinters, nails, broken beams. The roof lay folded like a crumpled hat. One wall had been dragged halfway into the pasture. Posts snapped like matchsticks. The air smelled of wet cedar, broken hay, and that strange electric scent storms leave behind. The house had taken a hit too. The back window blown in. Glass like sugar across the kitchen floor. Part of the roof peeled back like a lid. The screen door hung sideways, clicking in the breeze like a nervous clock. Two of the goats lay still near the fence, one crumpled against a post. 3 of the cows were missing, their hoof prints lost in the slurry of wind and earth. Earl didn't say anything. He just knelt, right there, in the wreckage of his past, knees in the dirt, hands on the splintered frame of what once held so many memories. His fingers curled around a broken beam like it was a dying animal. Nora found him like that. She didn't speak. Instead, she stepped closer, eyes scanning the debris. She bent to pick up something small, half buried in the mud. A plank. Hand-carved. Faded. J. Kincaid. The same name that hung above their fireplace. The same piece of wood their son had etched the summer he helped Earl rebuild the west wall. Now cracked clean in 2. She held it in her hands like it was bone, not wood. Her throat closed around something too large to swallow. She didn't cry. Not yet. just stood with that broken name pressed against her chest, the mud soaking through her apron, the wind still humming low around her ears. Earl moved slowly, dragging the bodies of the goats to the side pasture where the ground was soft enough to dig. His shovel sank deep, each heave slower than the last. He didn't ask Nora to help, didn't look for the cows, didn't talk about the barn. He just worked. The silence between them was not empty. It was full of everything they didn't want to say out loud. That they had no money for repairs, no insurance, that Earl's shoulder wouldn't lift what it used to, that Nora's hands shook when they tried to hold too much. That grief, real grief, didn't always scream. Sometimes it just sat quietly on the porch and waited. That evening, after the tools had been put away and the land had gone still again, Nora sat by the fireplace with the broken nameplate in her lap. The fire didn't crackle like usual. It sighed. The clock ticked loud on the mantel, every second a reminder of what didn't return. She didn't ask Earl what came next, because she already knew. There was no one left to call. No check coming in the mail. No miracle carpenter knocking on the door. Only time. And the woods. And whatever it was that took the cornbread each morning without leaving crumbs. Outside, the stars began to peek through the shredded clouds. The air was still, too still, as if the storm had emptied something it wasn't supposed to. And just beyond the ridge, something watched, but didn't move, not yet. The sun rose low and slow, dragging behind it a fog that clung to the broken fence line like wet breath. Flint Hills had not yet caught its rhythm again. The land was quieter now, like it too was trying to remember what had been lost. The storm had carved its scar across the property, and in the light of early dawn, that wound was still fresh. The soil was slick with water and regret. Patches of mud glistened where grass used to be. The cattle were subdued, lingering near the edge of the pasture, as if afraid to step into the places where the wind had screamed. One of the dogs lay curled beneath the porch steps, not sleeping, just watching. Earl was already outside. He moved slow, his boots sinking with every step into the earth that had once held him steady. He had brought nothing with him but a length of rope and his silence. His body ached more than usual. His shoulder throbbed beneath the old denim of his jacket, reminding him with each movement that he was not built for storms anymore. But something in him told him to walk the perimeter anyway. Not for fences, not for the missing cows, but for the thing he couldn't name. He rounded the corner of the pasture where the lower land dipped toward the trees, and that's when he saw it. At first, he thought it was just more storm damage. Another mess to clean, another reminder of what had gone. But this wasn't wreckage. It was impression. A mark. One that didn't belong to any boot or hoof. It was long, deep. Toes. 5 of them, spaced wide apart. A heel pressed into the mud so firmly it had displaced water. Nearly 20 inches from tip to back, and wide enough to fit both of Earl's feet inside with room to spare. He crouched, his breath catching somewhere behind his ribs. He didn't touch it, just looked, then looked again. There were more. Another print 5 feet ahead, half on a stone. Then another, breaking through the high weeds like someone, or something, had walked straight through without needing a path. He followed them without meaning to. Not tracking, just drifting. One boot after another, following the impossible rhythm of the prints like they were pulling him forward. They curved slightly toward the tree line, then stopped. No drag, no turn, just gone. As if whoever made them had simply stepped into the fog and let the world forget them. When he turned back, he saw the tools. That's when his chest tightened in a way he couldn't explain. The rusted hammer he'd left tossed on the ground 2 days ago. Now it sat neatly on the stone rail by the busted barn wall. The bent nails he'd scattered in frustration were collected in a little tin can he hadn't used since last spring. The ladder, broken on its side after the storm, now leaned against what was left of the outer frame, the snapped rung tied clean with twine. Not new twine, old, gray, knotted in a way Earl hadn't seen in years. Not since his grandfather used to mend fence posts with nothing but tree bark and clever fingers. He didn't call for Nora. He didn't move right away. He just stood there, the cold mist curling around his ankles, watching the strange order that had replaced his chaos. The barn was still broken, still battered, but now it looked like someone had started something, someone who didn't knock. He went back to the porch without a word. Nora was there, kneeling by the edge of the steps, folding something into wax paper, a small triangle of cornbread, fresh from the skillet. She looked up once, her eyes searching his face, but she didn't speak. Earl stood by the railing, wiping his boots on the mat harder than necessary. "Out by the trees," he said, voice low. "You ever seen prints that size?" Nora's hands slowed, fingers pressing the corners of the wax paper tighter. "No," she said simply. He nodded once, then again, then walked inside, boots heavy on the floorboards. That afternoon, Nora returned to the stone under the hickory tree, the one she'd visited every morning since the storm. The fog had lifted by then, but the air still felt soft, like it wasn't sure what season it belonged to. She knelt without a cushion, ignoring the pinch in her knees. She placed the triangle of cornbread beneath the tree again, same as always. But this time she didn't leave right away. She whispered, "Thank you." Just 2 words, quiet, like a thread offered across a chasm. The next morning the bread was gone. Not a crumb? The glass jar of water was empty too, but not tipped, just drained. Earl said nothing. But he didn't roll his eyes like Buck Rollins would have. He didn't call it nonsense. He didn't mutter. He just took his coffee out to the steps and sat beside Nora, staring out at the spot where the prints had been. They were gone now, lost to the morning rain. But something about that clearing still felt watched. Not hunted, not haunted, just noticed. The barn frame stood untouched that day, but Earl found a pile of lumber stacked just beside the north fence. He hadn't cut it. Nora hadn't either. Some of the pieces were old, some fresh. All of them stripped and sized with precision. No sawdust, no chips, just clean wood waiting. He looked around, listened. Nothing. Just the buzz of late-morning flies and the slow groan of a windmill turning. That evening he found the fence line mended. 3 posts replanted. Wire tightened, not with metal fasteners, but with looped knots, tied with bark, cedar maybe, twisted tight and slick with sap. He crouched, inspecting one of the ties. It held firm, tighter than anything his own hands could have done. Back at the porch, Nora was pouring water into the jars. This time she added a second piece of bread. "Just in case," she said. Earl didn't argue. That night, neither of them closed the curtains all the way. They weren't sure why. Something had begun, but it hadn't introduced itself yet. And from the dark edge of the trees, something waited. Not with hunger, not with malice, but with an old kind of patience. The kind that watches, the kind that remembers, the kind that answers when no one is calling. The fog came back just before dawn, rolling in low across the pastures like it had risen from the soil itself, thick and silver and quiet. It moved between the cedar trees and over the torn edges of the old barn's footprint, softening what had been broken. The world looked smaller in it, closer, like everything had drawn inward overnight, holding its breath. The birds didn't sing that morning, not a single chirp. Even the wind, usually restless in Flint Hills, stayed still. Nora stood at the porch rail again, hands wrapped around a chipped mug, eyes narrowed into the haze. She hadn't lit the lantern yet. Didn't need to. The shape of morning was different now. It had changed quietly, like a shift in a dream just before waking. Earl had gone out early, said nothing. Just put on his boots, grabbed the same rope he hadn't used since the tornado, and walked toward the rise. Nora let him go. There was no point in stopping a man chasing questions he couldn't name, but something in her stomach tugged tight as she watched his figure dissolve into the mist, step by step, until the prairie took him. Earl had told himself he just wanted to check the fence line. He'd told himself he didn't care what left those prints, or who'd tidied up the tools, or how that bark-twined knot had held the fence better than any steel wire ever had. But what he didn't say, not even to himself, was that part of him wanted to see it again. Whatever it was. He didn't need a name for it, just the shape. The truth of its existence in a world that had otherwise stopped surprising him. He didn't have to wait long. It began with a creak. Not metal, wood. Not broken, built. He froze. Boots in wet grass. The rope still looped across his shoulder. The sound came again, softer this time. A low rhythm, repeated, not hurried, like someone driving pegs or framing a door. The mist shifted in pulses, revealing little more than shadows at first. Shapes, moving, slow, tall. Then a flicker of movement, deliberate, heavy, quiet. 3 figures, not silhouettes, not tricks of light, real, closer than they should have been. The largest one stood still, half shrouded in fog, watching. Its hair was thick and graying, matted around the shoulders like an old dog's coat in winter. It didn't move right away. It just stood there, gazing across the broken field like it remembered when it was still whole. The second figure limped slightly, carrying something across its shoulder, a beam, thick and dark, soaked from the rain but shaped, carried not with ease, but with intent. The third was smaller, quick, darting between the others, passing tools. No, not tools. Branches, vines, things sharpened and worn to function by hand. They worked in silence, like they had done this before, like they were finishing something that had started long before Earl was ever born. He didn't speak. Couldn't. His body wouldn't allow it. Not from fear, but from awe. There was no menace in the movement, no threat, just labor, measured and meaningful. Each step, each lift, each placement of wood and stone, coordinated without sound, without command. As if rhythm and memory had replaced language. The one with silver in its coat turned. Its eyes found Earl. Not surprised, not angry, just aware. Earl's heart stuttered. He didn't raise his hands, didn't step back. The look wasn't hostile. It was something else. Like a man recognizing another who'd also lost a barn, who knew what it meant to build something with your own hands just to watch it fall to wind. The figure blinked once, slowly, then turned back to its task. Earl stayed rooted in place for another moment. The breath in his chest held like he was beneath water. Then he stepped backward. One step, then another. He didn't turn his back, just moved slow, like backing out of a memory that wasn't his to keep. When he reached the porch again, Nora was waiting. She didn't ask, just looked at his face, and something in her softened. He sat down, breath unsteady. She didn't speak. Instead, she stepped inside, returned with a basket. Inside, 3 fresh pieces of cornbread, a jar of goat's milk sealed with twine. She walked them to the edge of the grass and placed the basket near the hickory tree. Not a word. No ceremony. Just a gesture. Quiet and clear. The fog thinned by afternoon, and when Nora checked the basket, only the jar remained. Empty, clean. Later that evening, Earl told her what he saw. Not every detail. Just enough. 3 figures. Working. Not animals. Not men. Something in between. Nora listened. Her hands never stopped moving. Peeling potatoes, slicing carrots. But her eyes held his. She didn't laugh. Didn't doubt. When he finished, she simply said, "Then we're not alone anymore." He nodded once. "Doesn't feel wrong." "No," she said, "it doesn't." That night they didn't lock the back door, and in the dim amber glow of the porch light, Nora left a note pinned to the frame of the doorway. Not written in ink, just a piece of fabric, tied in a certain way. A fold her mother taught her, one that meant peace, one that meant welcome. By morning it was gone, but where it had been, a new beam had been placed. Not nailed, but wedged with perfect weight, fitted with a tenon so clean it looked machined. But it wasn't. No sawdust, no metal, just hand, time, and intention. And from the tree line, 3 sets of eyes watched the sun rise and disappeared into the fog again, without ever once making a sound. It started again just after midnight. A soft pounding rhythm carried through the air like distant drums under dirt. Not loud, not violent, just steady, intentional. Earl lay awake, staring at the ceiling while the sound tapped its way into his chest. Nora was already up, moving in that quiet way she did when something outside pulled at her bones more than sleep ever could. The oil lamp flickered on the kitchen table, casting long shadows across the worn walls and half-packed baskets of preserves that still hadn't made it back into the pantry after the storm. The house felt like it was holding still, listening with them. Outside, the wind barely moved, but something else was. The sound of wood being driven into earth. The occasional groan of timber settling, the dry scuff of something large brushing against gravel. By sunrise, the outline of the new frame had grown taller, more defined, like bones reassembling themselves. No signs of vehicles, no tire tracks, no footprints, just progress. The eastern wall stood almost shoulder height now, and the pitch of the roof was beginning to take shape. There was no hammering, not like humans would have done it. No nails, no shouting across lumber piles. Only that same quiet rhythm. Thick pegs driven through hand-carved joints. Notched beams set together like puzzles solved in a different language. Earl stood at the edge of the yard, arms crossed tight over his chest. The disbelief had passed. This wasn't a trick anymore. Wasn't a strange dream stretched over grief and storm shock. This was help. Real. Heavy, built one silent piece at a time, and he hadn't earned it. He didn't know how to pay it back. Nora came out after him with a fresh jar of ointment in one hand and a folded cloth in the other. Her basket held bundles of dried arnica, goldenrod, and the last of her comfrey, already crushed into a dark green paste. She walked past Earl without a word, down the slope toward the base of the tree line. That same old flat stone waited there, and she placed the jar gently in the middle. She didn't speak to it, didn't pray. She just laid the cloth beside it, tucked in a sprig of wild mint, and stepped back into the tall grass. The next morning, the jar was empty, wiped clean. The cloth was gone. In its place sat a single feather, long, dark, and glossy as river stone, nestled into the hollow of the mint leaves like it belonged there. That same day, the barn had a roof line, not finished, but formed, and above the doorway frame, 2 perfectly aligned cedar beams crossed each other at an angle, lashed not with rope, but with long curls of bark twisted tight like tendon. That night, Nora left out more than medicine. She left a loaf of bread, still warm from the hearth, and half a jar of goat's milk. She tied the cloth in a different fold, one used for healing. The feather was tucked into the knot. She set the offering down without ceremony, and returned before Earl had even gotten up from his chair. But the peace didn't last. Around dusk, Buck Rollins drove his pickup straight up to the Kincaid gate. Headlights still on, rifle racked in the back window, and something mean in the way he slammed his door shut. He didn't walk to the house, just leaned back on the fender and waited until Earl came down from the porch. "You seen the prints?" Buck asked without preamble, thumbing the brim of his sweat-stained cap. "Things back. Big. Maybe more'n one." Earl didn't flinch. "Noticed a few?" Buck sniffed like the air had soured. "Left some fresh tracks near my fence last night. Found my chicken coop open. Half the birds gone. No blood. Just empty. That ain't coyote work." Earl said nothing. "I'm thinking it's time someone put a stop to this mess. Set a few traps. Maybe stake out the ridge." "Don't," Earl said, his voice even. "It's not what you think." Buck's eyes narrowed. "You telling me it ain't real?" "I'm telling you it's not hunting you. And it's not hurting anyone who doesn't go looking for trouble." Buck spat in the grass. "Sounds like you're protecting it." "I'm protecting what's on my land." That thing walks across your land, Earl. Don't mean it belongs there. Earl didn't move. Not everything that walks here answers to you. Buck stared a second too long. Then he smirked. You do what you want, but I got traps set tonight. Big ones. Steel jaw. Won't be back here till morning, but if I catch it... He left the sentence unfinished. It didn't need finishing. He got in the truck and drove off, kicking gravel in his wake. That night, Nora stood at the edge of the yard again, arms wrapped tight around herself as the wind picked up. Not storm wind, just the kind that came when something deep in the grass started shifting. She watched the line of trees darken, eyes fixed on the narrow gap where she'd left the jar earlier that day. Nothing moved, until it did. A shape stepped forward, slow, deliberate, holding something in its arm. Tall, thick-furred, muscles under a coat that shimmered faintly where the moon caught it. No face visible, just form. Massive and quiet, and standing with the weight of centuries in its bones. Then it raised an arm, and something swung from its hand. A twisted metal trap, the kind Buck had described. Its jaws bent, crushed, rendered useless. It hung from the creature's grasp like a broken toy. The figure turned, walked into the trees, and left the ruined trap dangling from a low branch by the clearing. Like a warning. Or a gift. Or a sign. Nora didn't sleep that night. She sat near the window, watching the shadows move across the field. Not afraid. Not exactly. Just bracing for what came next. A line had been drawn. Quiet, but certain. By morning the trap was still there. Earl took it down and buried it behind the barn. He didn't say why. But that afternoon, when he walked past the doorway of the new structure, he found something nestled between the beams. A strip of cloth he recognized from Nora's offering, folded neatly, tied with mint and cedar, and tucked inside it, a small carving, smooth, polished, shaped like a curled hand around a bundle of wheat. He brought it back inside and placed it beside the fireplace. Neither of them spoke as the sun dipped low. But as darkness spread, the house felt warmer. And from the far woods, the quiet pounding began again. Not a threat, not a call, just the sound of something building where silence used to be. The second storm didn't come with warning like the first one had. No sky turning green, no dogs howling in advance, no uneasy silence pressing against the windows. It came sudden, like a punch to the chest. 1 minute the wind was steady, the air mild, the clouds dragging low like sleep-heavy eyelids. The next, the horizon split open with a roll of thunder that didn't end, just kept growling from somewhere deep beneath the soil. Rain hit the tin roof hard and fast, rattling like handfuls of nails. Nora had just brought in the last of the laundry when the light flickered, then blinked out. The lanterns were already trimmed. She knew better than to trust power lines during Kansas spring. Earl hadn't come in yet. Said he was checking the west posts again, making sure Buck's traps hadn't crept any closer. Nora stood at the back door, watching the storm hit the ridge with full force, her hand tightening on the frame, eyes combing the trees for movement that didn't belong to wind. Then she heard it, a crash, sharp and close. Wood splintering. Something heavy giving way. And her husband's voice, a sound not quite a yell, not quite a cry, just a forced breath that snapped her heart wide open. She ran. The rain slapped her face, soaked her sleeves within seconds, and turned the ground to paste under her boots. She followed the fence line, past the new timber beams, through the half-finished frame of what would have been the new doorway. The wind shoved her sideways, but she kept moving, breath ragged, hands outstretched in the dark. She found him half buried under the collapsed beam from the upper frame, the one they hadn't finished tying down yet. Earl was pinned at the shoulder, eyes squinting against the rain, lips tight from pain he didn't want to give voice to. His free hand clutched the edge of a support post, but his grip was weakening. Nora dropped to her knees, mud swallowing the hem of her dress. She tried lifting the beam, but it wouldn't budge. Her palms slid against the wet wood. Useless. Earl groaned through his teeth, face pale, eyes flickering toward hers with a quiet apology that burned more than words. She pressed both hands to his chest, feeling for his breath, his ribs. Nothing broken, not there, at least. But he couldn't move, not without help. She opened her mouth to call out, but the wind drowned her. Lightning split the sky behind her, illuminating the half-built frame, the storm-churned grass, and the shape, huge, silent, standing in the edge of the dark. Not one, three. They stepped into the clearing like ghosts pulled into flesh, rain sliding off their thick coats in long silver streams. The tallest of them moved first, slow but certain, approaching without caution, without sound. His arms hung long, fingertips curled, shoulders broad as the barn's broken frame. The younger one with the uneven gait came next, already bending toward the beam. The smallest, the one that always moved like wind, slipped past them both and ducked beneath the half-collapsed roof, finding the fire pit and sparking embers beneath wet tinder with a handful of moss and an old steel shard. Nora didn't speak, didn't move, just knelt beside her husband as those beings, those builders, watchers, neighbors in silence, gathered around them like kin. The tall one knelt beside Earl, his wide hand reaching without hesitation, pressing gently against Earl's chest, then to his forehead, as if measuring something more ancient than fever. The rain hadn't stopped. Thunder still rolled above them, but inside the half-formed barn, it felt like time had slowed. The limping one grunted low, not a growl, not a threat, just a sound of focus, and bent his shoulder beneath the beam. Muscles flexed, mud shifted. The weight lifted just enough for Earl to breathe. The tall one leaned in, hands bracing him, while the smaller one rolled a flat stone beneath the open corner, propping it up with a strength that seemed impossible for its size. Nora moved fast then, cradling Earl's head, pulling his legs free, his boots dragged through the muck, knees cut and shirt soaked. But he was alive, breathing, conscious. The tall figure stood back, letting her work, eyes watching with a calm that made her throat tighten. She looked up at him, at them. Rain dripping from her lashes, heart pounding. "Thank you," she whispered, not even sure if they understood. But the oldest one blinked slowly, then placed something beside her. A shape wrapped in oilskin, damp but intact. She reached for it after they'd stepped back, after the fire inside had caught, casting warm flickers against the beam, and unwrapped it with trembling fingers. Inside, her son's army coat, the one she thought had been lost in the storm. Mud-caked, rain-stained, but folded neatly. Inside the pocket, tucked between the lining and the threadbare patch on the elbow, was the keychain he'd carried in high school. A tarnished pewter whistle with half the letter K still etched along the side. The coat smelled like cedar smoke and earth. She pressed it to her chest, her breath hitching. She hadn't seen that whistle in 20 years. They hadn't just lifted a beam. They'd brought back memory. By the time Earl stirred enough to speak, the figures were gone. Vanished into the trees like they'd never been there, leaving no prints, no proof, just the fire, still burning low, and the rain, beginning to soften into mist. That night, Nora dressed Earl's shoulder in silence. The bruising would take weeks, maybe longer, but the break wasn't as bad as she feared. She laid the coat across the foot of the bed, the whistle resting on the top. Earl watched her as she moved, his eyes not questioning anymore, only grateful. Outside, the wind had shifted again. Not angry, just tired. She stepped onto the porch once more before sleep found her. The sky had cleared in streaks, stars peeking out in patches. She carried with her a fresh cloth, this one folded twice, with a cedar sprig tied inside and a stone button from her son's old shirt. She placed it beneath the hickory like always, hands steady. Then she whispered into the dark, You brought him back to me. Not alive, but something I thought I'd lost. And though nothing stirred from the woods, though no reply came, she felt watched. Not in fear, not in threat, just known. In the early gray of dawn, Earl stirred from sleep. Nora hadn't returned to bed, but the house smelled like wood smoke. And something else. Stew. When he stepped into the kitchen, she was already at the stove, ladling broth into an old tin cup, the kind her son used to carry in his mess kit. On the table next to the cornbread was the jar of salve she'd left out days before, refilled now. The paste thicker, stronger, and smelling of crushed bark and something ancient. She looked up, met his gaze. "They don't owe us," she said, "but they remember." Earl nodded. And when he sat down, when he lifted the cup to his lips and tasted the wild herbs stitched through the broth, he knew they were not alone, and they were not forgotten. The wheat was knee-high when the roof finally went on. June light fell warm across the fields, and the barn stood whole again, not the same shape as before, but truer somehow. The lines cleaner, the joints tighter, the wood darker in places where no one remembered cutting it. The sloped roof curved just enough to keep rain from pooling, and the cedar beams above the doorway crossed like a sheltering prayer. Not a single nail held it together, and yet the structure didn't groan. It breathed. Solid. Alive in a way old barns rarely are. Earl stood beneath the eave that morning, fingers grazing the smooth grain of a corner post. He traced the notches there, the chiseled pattern tucked low into the wood where most folks wouldn't notice. 3 nested chevrons, carved so clean they looked grown. He didn't ask what they meant. Didn't need to. It was a signature, a mark of hands that worked without boasting. Nora brought out the last of the folded linens, the clean feed sacks, the old tools she'd oiled weeks ago in hope more than logic. Everything went back in its place like it knew it had a home again. They didn't say much that day. No ceremony, no ribbon, just quiet steps on a firm ground, hands brushing against cool walls that hadn't stood here a month ago. But the town was restless. Not all storms came with thunder. Buck Rollins had been circling again. Not just him now. Word had spread. Somebody'd told the fellows at the feed store about shadows behind the tree line, about odd footprints showing up near old cattle sheds, about Nora's goat milk disappearing night after night without so much as a paw print left in the mud. Folks whispered, and when they did, the story twisted. The way fear always does. What began as wonder turned into suspicion, and then suspicion became threat. It was late afternoon when Buck showed up again, this time with his cousin from Topeka and 2 other men Nora didn't recognize. They pulled up in a battered green truck, rifle racks glinting through the windows. She heard the tires before she saw them. The crunch of gravel cut sharp across the fields. Earl stepped off the porch, body stiff, boots planted. Nora didn't wait for them to speak. She walked out carrying the basket. Inside, 3 cornbread rounds still warm, a small jar of honey, and a folded cloth the color of dusk. Her hands didn't shake. Her voice was calm. "We don't want trouble," she said. "And I reckon you know you don't either." Buck stepped forward, trying to puff himself up like a younger man. But he didn't speak first. The stranger beside him did. Tall, lean, sharp eyes, set in a face that didn't belong in fields, more like courthouse corners and backroom warnings. "Ma'am," he said, too polite to mean it. "We heard some unusual stories from neighbors nearby. Thought we'd stop in, see for ourselves." Nora didn't flinch. "Stories are cheaper than nails these days, but if you're looking to accuse us of something, might as well do it without pretending." The man looked past her, toward the barn. His jaw ticked. He saw what they all did, that it had been rebuilt, better than most men in this town could have managed, and not a single board purchased from the lumber yard. That kind of miracle demands explanation, and explanations scare people more than silence ever did. "That yours?" he asked, nodding toward the barn. "It is now," Earl answered, voice low. "And who helped you build it?" No one answered. The stranger stepped forward. "See, thing is, I don't care much about rumors, but folks get nervous. They see shapes at night, hear things in the woods. A few of them think you're hiding something." "We're not hiding," Nora said. "We're living. There's a difference." The man stared hard at her. But something about her face, lined but not weak, steady as stone, made him pause. Then Buck scoffed behind him, muttered something about godless weirdos and keeping watch. Earl stepped between them, not aggressive, just firm. Nora looked straight at Buck. "You know better than most what a rifle can't fix, Buck. You point one out here, you might not like what comes looking back." The air went quiet then. No one moved, no one blinked. Just that standoff kind of stillness that stretches seconds long enough to remember forever. Then the man gave a tight smile and tipped his hat in the wrong direction. "Well, guess we'll be going." They turned back to the truck. Buck lingered. His eyes landed on the basket in Nora's hands, and something in him wavered. He didn't speak, just spit near the tire and climbed into the cab. The engine rumbled. They drove off without looking back. That night Nora hung the coat, her son's jacket, cleaned, mended, sleeves folded neatly, the fabric still holding the scent of earth and pine. She didn't nail it or drape it over a hook. She hung it on the barn door beam, high and central, where it would catch the morning light. She didn't say why. Earl knew. He didn't question her anymore. She'd chosen that coat to stand watch. That evening, as dusk settled and the first cicadas began their slow summer song, Nora stepped outside to check the porch baskets. One was empty, the medicine one. But the cloth inside had been replaced with something she hadn't expected. Thread, long, coarse fibers, twisted, then woven. Woven with a pattern she didn't recognize at first. When she brought it closer, the light from the lantern revealed it. A patch. Rough, greenish, but firm, sewn with grass, and already fixed to the back of the coat. She didn't touch it, just stood there, watching. Earl came out later to check the latch on the gate. When he saw the patch, his brow tightened, not in fear, but in knowing. The thread was familiar, not the material, but the care, the precision. It had the same honesty as the joints in the barn beams. The same quiet dignity as the way the roof caught water without pooling. The same trust that doesn't ask for praise or permission. The next morning, Nora climbed the ladder herself, despite Earl telling her not to, and tucked a fresh pouch of dried apple slices into the hayloft, beside the rafters where the wind liked to hum. She left a slip of parchment beside it. Just 3 words, scrawled with a shaky hand. "For your trouble." That afternoon, a red-winged blackbird landed on the porch railing and watched them through the window. When Nora stepped out, it didn't fly, just turned its head. Then it dropped something, a stone, smooth, shaped like a small wedge, and on it, the same chevron marks carved deep across one side. That night, the barn glowed in the moonlight like it had been born of the prairie itself, not built from it. The chevron above the doorway caught the light and held it, soft and steady, like a lantern hung in the spine of an old cathedral. They didn't speak of it, but both Nora and Earl stood out there longer than usual, breathing, waiting, and from the woods beyond, just barely past the corn rows and the fence line, something stood watching too, breathing, waiting, and still building. The sun was just beginning to tip westward when Nora stepped out onto the porch with her hands wrapped around a steaming mug. The barn caught the light the way old churches sometimes do, soft, reverent, as if it were remembering something. The wheat whispered under the hush of the late summer breeze, golden heads bowing just slightly, enough to remind a person that even the land knows how to pay respects. The rebuilt structure stood proud now, its shape no longer a wound but a monument. Not a monument to loss, but to hands, some seen, some not, that had made it whole again. From the porch, it looked like it had always been there, as if the storm had never happened, as if time had folded its mistakes back into the earth and left behind only what mattered. Nora didn't say much anymore. Not because she didn't have things to say, but because silence had started to mean more. Words felt too small beside everything that had taken place. Too sharp. Too late. But she still had her rituals. She watered the tomatoes before the sun got too high. She left her offerings under the hickory, never asking for anything, only thanking. She ran her fingers over the sleeve of her son's coat each night before bed, where it hung like a sentinel in the barn doorway. The patch of woven grass still stitched firm where the tear used to be. Some things you didn't mend, some things you left sacred. The neighbors had mostly gone quiet. Whatever rumors had spread after Buck and his cousin came sniffing around, they didn't stick. Maybe it was the way Buck stopped coming by after the incident with the twisted trap. Or maybe it was the way folks like Reverend Mayfield started referring to the Kincaids' rebuilt barn as a gift from Providence, without so much as blinking. People talk a lot when they're scared, but they talk even more when they can't explain something. Sometimes it's easier to fold mystery into God and leave it at that. One afternoon in early August, Reverend Mayfield stopped by without his collar, just wearing denim and sweat. He stood at the bottom of the porch steps and tipped his hat. "You got good folks helping you," he said, nodding toward the barn. "Whoever they are." Nora didn't correct him. He didn't ask more. Just nodded again and walked back down the gravel drive. Earl had gone out earlier that morning to tend the south field, where the grass had started to grow wild again. His shoulder still ached from the collapse, but he didn't complain about it. Didn't even mention it unless he caught Nora looking at him too long. That morning, she'd found him resting in the shadow of the barn, sitting on an overturned feed bucket with a blade of grass between his teeth and his hat pulled low. There was a stillness in him now, the kind that doesn't come from giving up, but from having seen just enough to stop needing more. She sat beside him for a while, the two of them saying nothing, just watching the ridge in the distance where the trees began their slow rise out of the wheat. From where they sat, the forest looked like the edge of a map, marked and unmapped all at once. "Think they're still out there?" Earl asked. Nora didn't look at him. "They never left." He nodded, as if that was what he'd hoped she'd say. That evening they ate by the window, the table still bearing the scars of years of meals, grief, and hands held tight through news no parent should ever receive. The fire was low. The radio stayed off. Nora spooned stew into bowls without a word. The meat was lean, the vegetables soft, the broth rich with bone and thyme. Outside, the stars began to press through the dusk like old friends returning after a long drive. When she rose to pour more water, her eyes caught on the far fence line. A shape, barely there, tall, still, then gone again into the fold of trees. She didn't call Earl to see, didn't say a word. She only stepped outside with the folded red and white cloth she'd been keeping in the cupboard since last Christmas. An old handkerchief of her son's, one she hadn't been ready to give up. Inside it, she wrapped 3 biscuits and a smooth stone she'd found by the well, shaped like a heart but cracked through the middle. She walked to the edge of the property, where the old gate creaked against the wind, and laid it on the stump near the fence, where the wood had split during the storm. She didn't look into the woods, just placed the offering and turned back toward the house. That night she slept dreamless, and in the morning only the cloth remained. But folded inside, in the place where the biscuits had been, was a single braided strand of hair, thick, black, coarse, and wound tight like cord, wrapped around the cracked hearthstone, now fused at the break with resin hardened like amber. She pressed it to her chest. Later that week, Martin came, their grandson. He hadn't been to the farm in 2 years, not since before the storm. College had pulled him far away, and grief had made the spaces between calls longer than they should have been. But he stepped off that bus with a satchel over one shoulder and dust on his sneakers, taller than Earl remembered, and quieter than Nora expected. They hugged long, without words. He slept in the spare room, where the wallpaper still peeled at the corners and the dresser held photographs too old to explain. He asked questions, the kind that come from someone who's been gone too long. But he listened. Really listened. When Earl showed him the new barn, Martin ran his fingers over the beams like he could feel the stories written into the grain. "Who built it?" he asked. Earl paused, then smiled. "Folks who know how to build." Martin didn't ask again. That evening, as fireflies blinked along the grass and the air carried that rich smell of summer dust and creosote, Martin wandered out to the barn alone. He stood beneath the eave, eyes tracing the old coat, the patches, the carved chevrons in the wood. And then he saw it, high up on the frame, carved not deep, but clear enough for time to hold. 3 arrows, nested into each other, pointing west. A symbol, a signature, a promise. He didn't say anything when he came back inside. But that night, as Nora tucked the blanket around him, he asked one thing. "Do they still come?" Nora looked at him, her hand resting on his shoulder. They never stopped. In the morning, the mist hung low again, and just beyond the edge of the wheat, a figure lingered, massive, silent, watching. Then, like breath fading on a window pane, it stepped into the trees and vanished, leaving behind nothing but the memory of hands that work in silence, gifts left without names, and a barn that still stood strong beneath a sky that no longer threatened to fall. And though no one ever said the word, not in town, not at the breakfast table, not in church pews or market lines, everybody knew. They had never been alone. They had only just started remembering. Some stories are not told to impress or frighten or even explain. Some stories are simply reminders that not all kindness comes with a name, and not all help asks for permission. Sometimes what's broken doesn't need to be replaced, only rebuilt. Not by force, not with pride, but with care. Quiet care. The kind that comes in the stillness between storms, in the breath between neighbors, in the silence between one heartbeat and the next. There are hands in this world that do not reach to take but to lift. Hands that build without applause, that mend without asking for thanks. Hands that remember the weight of grief and offer, instead of answers, something better, presence. And maybe that's the heart of it. That healing doesn't always arrive with explanations or logic. It doesn't speak loudly. It simply shows up, over and over, in the way something as simple as a shared task or a returned memory can patch what we thought was lost for good. The world holds more mystery than fear, more good than noise, and more unseen kindness than we're often willing to believe. The truth is, there will always be things we don't fully understand. Figures that pass in the mist, footprints that vanish by morning, shelters that rise without blueprints. But maybe we don't need to understand them. Maybe it's enough to witness, to be grateful, to live alongside the unknown, not with suspicion, but with respect. And in that quiet coexistence, in that unspoken agreement between seen and unseen, we find something rare, not proof, not certainty, but peace. Thank you for listening to this story. If it touched something in you, some memory, some ache, some hope, you're not alone. We invite you to leave a comment, share your thoughts, and let others know they're not alone either. And if you'd like more stories like this, stories of wonder, compassion, and the quiet magic that still lingers in forgotten corners, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Your voice matters here. We're listening. And remember, sometimes the greatest acts of grace are the ones that leave no trace, except in the heart.